It's now time to hear from our keynote speaker, Ms. Becky Curran. Becky brings a deep understanding and perspective to the theme of disability in the workplace. As someone with personal and professional perspectives on the topic, she can speak to both sides of that question. From countless efforts at becoming employed, to sitting in the position where she made decisions on recruiting and hiring and improving the possibilities for applicants with a disability, Becky has an important message for all of us. Becky received her Bachelor of Science in Marketing from Providence College, where she gained a passion for influencing change behind the scenes in the entertainment industry. Upon graduation, and after 100 job interviews, you hear that? That's persistence. Not job applications, by the way. Submitting your application on the internet, okay, that's a start. 100 interviews. Becky started working in the entertainment marketing department, followed by the comedy touring department at Creative Arts Agency, the world's leading entertainment and sports agency. CAA. If you know anything about sports, you know about CAA. They represent some of the biggest athletes, most famous artists in the world. 5 years after that, she worked at CBS television studios, where she assisted with the casting of pilots and TV series. During the transition, she also served as the marketing director and co-founding board member of the Catalina Film Festival. Becky has also founded Disability in Media, which focuses on positive disability inclusion with storytelling through media, social media. Most recently, she spent 3.5 years working in the Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity Department at the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, also known as SAG-AFTRA, the world's largest entertainment union. At SAG-AFTRA, she supported the implementation of a national diversity plan of action to achieve accurate representation of those groups historically included from the entertainment and news media. Becky currently serves on the Board of Advisors for the National Center for Disability Journalism at Arizona State University. And as a motivational speaker and advocate for inclusion everywhere, Becky strives to teach acceptance while educating and motivating all people to establish goals and work hard to accomplish them. She's ready to come share her story, so please, a CUNY hello for Ms. Becky Curran.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Carlos for tracking me down and bringing me here today. I'm really excited to be here. So how many of you have a little person in your circle, your social circle, someone you've met in person, little person? All right, there are some hands. In most rooms I walk into, people have not seen a little person before. So that's why in my introduction, I am still very strongly passionate about changing what we see in the media because it affects how we're treated in society. When I was born, my parents are actually average height. My dad's 6'4". I have an older sister who is average height as well. Most little people are born to average height parents. My dad always joked and he said he wanted 2 children, my mom wanted 1, so they settled at 1.5. And one of the reasons I like to kind of start off talking about that is it's important for people to know that you can laugh with me. And we're in this together. We're all in this world together. And we just want to make it better and more accepting. So when I was first born, my parents had never met a little person. They only saw little people in the media, in elves and leprechaun characters. They didn't know what to expect. The doctor in the delivery room, fortunately, had seen a little person before, and they were able to kind of figure out, okay, she has dwarfism, now let's just figure out the next best steps. I almost didn't make it through the night, and it could have just been early birth complications, but after that next step, my parents were told to go to a geneticist at Tufts Medical Center in Boston, and they got to the receptionist, and the receptionist said, "Follow the sign down the hall that says birth defects." And my dad was not happy. He was just trying to learn as much as possible about raising his child in a hopefully accepting world. And he convinced the medical center to change the sign to genetics because he wanted to make sure that no other new parents were going to experience that when they first walk into the hospital where they're supposed to get advice and care. And that's kind of just a testament of how supportive and strong my parents were throughout my whole upbringing. And there was nothing that I couldn't do. I grew up participating in sports with my average height peers. I actually didn't even get to know other little people until my college years. I had some surgeries growing up. One thing that little people don't often talk about is the medical complications that come with dwarfism, but we don't want to talk about it because we don't want that to prevent people from including us in society, and we don't want it to be a risk if we're about to go work somewhere and that may come up along the line. I ended up having bone taken out of my legs when I was 3, and then I had bone put back into my legs when I was 13, and then I lost the ability to walk in 10th grade. I was actually sailing, and I thought it was the circulation of my wetsuit, but it was due to spinal cord compression. I was fortunate to, 29 days later, get surgery from Dr. Ben Carson. I know a lot of people aren't a fan of his political route, but he did save my life. I'm still so thankful to this day that I was able to regain the ability to walk. But one of my biggest struggles during that time was missing 29 days of school. I worked so hard to stay and keep up with my average height peers, and I was in all honors classes, and it was really frustrating that I had to then kind of take a step back. And I know I needed to address that surgery, but it was a very difficult time to go back. I was in college preparatory classes that next year, and then fortunately, by my senior year, I was able to get into more honors classes and AP. I ended up applying to 9 colleges, and the one I chose to go to was Providence College in Rhode Island. The reason I chose to go there, we were on a tour, and there was a little person who was in the cafeteria, and I thought, okay, great. This environment has at least been exposed to one little person. And I was thankful that people did respect me, at least the staff. When I was trying to fit in with all my average height white peers, it was a struggle socially. My roommate freshman year, I didn't tell her I was a little person. On the phone, we got along really well leading up to the time we moved in. She ended up pushing my bed over to the side of the room like it didn't matter, that I didn't matter. It took about 6 months for her to start to accept me. I almost moved out, but there really was no alternative. And she actually has reached out in the recent past, because she knows that I've brought this story up in my speeches. But I think it's important to tell people the reality of things that happen. So I was in a living situation trying to adjust to school. College years are the time where you really get to know yourself. You get to know who you want to be, what career path you want to pursue. And she's here terrified of me, and every night I get treated disrespectfully just because of me being me. And I think a lot of that sometimes stems from those perceptions, what people see in the media. And I was a marketing major in college, so I wanted to pursue advertising or marketing. And I ended up applying close to the end of school to about 170 ad agencies in Boston. I saw a newspaper article, and Allied Advertising was the one that offered me an internship. They were the intermediary between the general public and the movie studios, and they would decide whether or not they would make any changes to the movies based on having advanced screenings and getting the target audience to come watch the screenings, and they could make alterations based on notes that I would submit. And that was the point where I really started to figure out the entertainment industry has a lot of influence, and I want to figure out how to get towards that and make that more changes. But I also knew that I couldn't voice what I was passionate about that early on. And I guess if I were to do it all over again, I maybe wouldn't have hit as many roadblocks just because I could say, this is what I want to do, this is the path I want to go on. You figure out along the way. But I also wanted to prove myself as an ethical worker, someone who worked hard before people started asking my opinion about what was it I was passionate about. So after college, I ended up moving out to Los Angeles. I was supposed to work for a talent manager. She happens to be another little person. I've yet to meet the lady to this day. So the job got me out to LA. I had a place to live. My parents said, you need a job, a place to live, we'll support you. I got out there, the job fell through. That's when I started applying. I applied to 1,000 jobs and went on 100 interviews. And it was clear that every single one of those interviews, I was qualified to do the job because they wouldn't have called me in for an interview. There were so many times where I would walk in the room and people were shaking. They were so nervous just to be in my presence. And I always recommend for people to just get rid of the elephant in the room as soon as possible during the interview process, because if you just ask someone how their day's going, you can both talk about the traffic or whatever may have come up. And that's why people with disabilities bring a lot of asset and value to the workplace, because you're doing so many things before you even get to work that day just to get out of bed. I have to make sure there's a step stool near my bed. I have to have a stool to reach the sink in the bathroom. I have hopes that the toilet seat isn't loose because when I'm jumping up there, I may pinch my leg. And I don't talk about those things because we don't want people to feel bad for us. But there are so many problem-solving things that happen before showing up, then we can solve problems in the workplace. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to prove that until I went through some temporary placement agencies. So they were able to place me somewhere and say, she's showing up to work. You can't tell her that she has to go home because she's going to just go work. And I did that for a bit. I was at the Hallmark Channel. Then I went to Creative Artists Agency. I ended up being a temp there for 7 months. It was known to be a temp to hire position. But they kept saying, there's a hiring freeze, that you're just not the right fit, it's not going to happen. And it got to the point where I had to have 2 bosses, work for 2 agents, and they fought and made sure that I got hired full-time. And that was in the entertainment marketing department, where we would influence brands and how they would be talked about in movies and TV shows. It was different than product placement, where you just say, I'll give you a 6-pack of Coke. It's okay, just use it wherever in the movie. We would read scripts and figure out, like, where could there be a Coca-Cola moment? Or we had Harley Davidson as a client, and we would try to find celebrities who were riding Harley Davidson motorcycles or not. And those who weren't, we were trying to give them to those people. We would give them a free motorcycle, but then we ran into Shia LaBeouf got one, and he gave it to his mom. So it didn't always work, but the brands were really passionate with working with the industry, and that kept proving how much influence the industry had. The marketing department started to have some cuts about 2.5 years in, and I ended up going to the comedy touring department. I had the opportunity to be part of a comedy club coverage group where I'd go to up to 4 shows a night and share feedback with the comedy department. And it reminded me a lot of that internship I had done previously, where the feedback really mattered and affected whether or not our agents were going to bring on these comedians as clients. And what was also great about it is, as hard as it is for someone who sticks out in the audience, I was able to share feedback if someone was making fun of me in the audience. And I think they appreciated that perspective. But soon after, about 2 years in the comedy department, people started asking me what was it that I was passionate about. I knew I didn't want to be an agent, but I was just holding on to that job so long because it took me forever to get there. And I started having some conversations saying, I want to figure out how to change what's in the media because it affects how I'm treated and how people like me are treated in society. And it stems down to even when someone's in the delivery room, finding out whether they have a child with dwarfism, like my parents. And I was able to host a panel discussion at Creative Artists Agency. This was in October of 2011. And they let me have the space. Unfortunately, only about 2 agents showed up, but 158 other people showed up who were passionate about the same thing. And we had a panel discussion of actors with disabilities, producers, writers, proving that there is talent out there. There are people who happen to have disabilities who are also very talented. And that's when I started a Twitter feed and a Facebook, Disability in Media. And I decided I don't want to have to just see negative portrayals on TV and in movies. I'm going to continue to share positive stories. Started Googling the word disability every day to find those positive stories to share. And then that's what kind of led me to a position at CBS Television Studios, where I could help influence the casting decisions and make sure that actors with disabilities were considered for roles. Unfortunately, soon after I got there, I realized there was such a miscommunication between the writers and producers and directors and the casting agents, because they just weren't willing to have an open mind. If someone said, we need a doctor with glasses, it would be a doctor average height with glasses or not non-disabled person. And people with disabilities can be anything. 70% of disabilities are invisible, but they weren't willing to grasp that. And before, just a step back quickly, before I left CAA, I was talking to one of the partners, and he actually told me that he had a dad who had no legs, who lived with him for 8 years. And I asked him after he told me, have you told this story to anyone else here? And he said no. And I continue to share it because I hope he will eventually share that story, because he represents clients like Robert Redford, George Clooney, Clint Eastwood, and they could create a story. There could be more stories out there like with people like him. And if more people in the entertainment industry and in the corporate America at the higher levels opened up about their relation to disability, the more everyone would realize, from the recruiter to the CEO, that everyone deserves to be included. And it's important to have that authentic storytelling. That's why I appreciated your story after your award, because it isn't easy, but we don't want people to feel bad for us. So after I spent some time in casting at CBS, I was approached with this, I saw this pilot, and it didn't end up becoming a show, but I was reading the script. I read all the scripts for the pilots that year, and the script was about these 2 guys that moved from Indianapolis to LA to work at Groupon. One guy's a homebody, so he just stays home at the apartment and talks to his friends online, and then the other guy wants to go out and meet friends. He goes to a coffee shop, and in the coffee shop, he meets someone who's described as 2 inches taller than a little person. It's like, why can't it be a little person? And I asked the question, and it didn't end up getting to the writers until about 2 months later, when they struggled to find someone 2 inches taller. And what I appreciated is the dialogue was really rich, because it showed the guy at home who was the homebody making fun of his friend for making friends with a little person. And although someone may say that's like mean, it's the reality of what happened. So it would have been an authentic story. And they ended up not finding someone, and the day before the table read asking me, oh, can we find a little person now since we can't find someone? And I just felt that was a little disrespectful, because it's the day before the table read and they weren't able to scramble and find someone, so they kind of had to change the storyline a bit. It's just so important to tell those stories and tell those realities. I ended up getting frustrated, and I kind of had a mutual separation from CBS, and it was very hard because I just had worked so hard to get my foot in the door, especially in that industry that's so competitive and image-based. I didn't know what was going to be next, but around that same time, my roommate at the time, he was a little person. He was another motivator for advocating for change because he was a talented actor. He was a foot shorter than I, and he was diagnosed with ALS. He was about to get his big break on a Disney TV show, and he fell on set, and those were the early symptoms of his ALS. So it was an emotional time. I decided to part ways, and I moved back to Boston. He had to move back to Georgia, where he was from. And I would still go visit him until he recently passed. But he was always a key motivator because he would sometimes go to auditions, and the casting directors would tell him before he got there, oh, you're going to be this. And then he gets there, and they're like, just kidding. This is something that's going to make fun of you. And they weren't going to be authentic and tell him the truth about where he was going. And he worked very hard to also deny a lot of degrading roles because he knew it affected how we're treated. And it's unfortunate that there are a lot of people who still accept roles. There was someone who accepted the role in The Wolf of Wall Street, and they made a point to say, if I didn't do it, someone else would. And I know that story needed to, or people wanted to tell that story, but in the beginning of the film, there's a dwarf tossing scene, and then later on they talk about how little people like it because it gives us attention and jobs. And then that movie influenced posters at bars around the country where they actually pay $10, people pay $10 to go in and watch a little person get tossed across the room. The Little People organization has been working hard to advocate against that, and hopefully we can continue to shut those activities down. But it just proves how much the media influences. They're like, this movie happened, so this works. And same with, there were 2 Snow White movies that came out a few years ago. One was Mirror, Mirror, one was Snow White and the Huntsman. I know they're very cautious and wanting to promote box office numbers with name actors. But in Snow White and the Huntsman, they had average-height people shrink down with CGI animation. They were name actors. But what if they've never met a little person before? Then they're acting as a little person. They're acting based on a perception prior, whether it's negative or positive in the media. So as hard as the industry was to leave, I knew I wasn't going to lose my connections. I was going to build stronger relationships. I went home to Boston, and I thought, what am I going to do next? I found my junior statement that I had written to apply to college, and it said in there that I wanted to be a part-time motivational speaker. And I said, well, I got to start somewhere. I worried a little bit. I thought that maybe I had failed because I didn't make it to a certain level in the entertainment industry. But my sister, who's a creative writing teacher, said, my students want to meet you. And I went into her class, and I didn't just have it be where I just go and hang out. I said, why don't I start practicing speaking? I'll come speak to your students, share my story, and then the more I practice, the better I can get. And I soon learned that there are a lot of people who want to hear stories and want to hear about my experiences, and it doesn't just relate to a person with a disability or a person of any area of diversity. Everyone can relate to each other. I went to a Little People meeting of parents, and I sat in and I said, I'm not a parent, but I just want to address whatever may be going on or in the school systems with your children. And I was surprised at how many of them talked about the bullying that's going on in their children's schools, especially when they're going from elementary school to middle school, where there may be 100 people in the elementary school, but then 500 in the middle school. And I was able to start talking to administrators, help with that transition. Tell them, just ask what accommodations someone may need. I could share what the accommodations I needed, but it's not necessarily going to be the same as what someone else wants. And I think people want as few accommodations as possible just so they can fit in. And I ended up helping. There was even a little person who was in a special education school that she didn't necessarily need to be there, helping with that transition. And I was fortunate. One of the biggest reasons why I wanted to give back is I didn't experience bullying in my early years. I had a friend, my parents strategically placed a friend in my class from preschool to 7th grade. I didn't really think much about it. I just thought it's cool that we get to be in the same class every year. And I think that really helped, having that ally and support. As we got later into high school, when my friends started liking guys, they thought, I don't know if we want to be around you. So that was a tough time, and that's when I really got involved in the Little People organization to then feel a different level of value in that way and find more people I could relate to. So I started doing the speaking. I ended up getting asked to go to Kenya to help start a Little People organization in Kenya. And we did a lot of advocating around Nairobi. And one of the biggest struggles there is little people are not known to be capable. A lot of people look at us and they think because we're small, we don't have much to offer. We're like a kid. And we were trying to be there and change those perceptions. And I'm so proud that they are continuing to do great work and making changes. I think sometimes when you're somewhere where, of course, there's a lot going on there, a lot of violence and things that happen there that also happen here, but you think that it's really hard for them, but they're able to get the attention of the president and of the senator of Nairobi to really support them because they're doing such great work. And we actually ended up leaving the day that Nelson Mandela died. We missed our flight. So it was powerful being there then as well. When I came back from Kenya, I was offered the position at SAG-AFTRA. And one of the reasons I even said in my statement, junior statement, I want to be a part-time motivational speaker is I started just to get really lonely. As much as I love speaking, I wanted to have something to complement it. So they gave me the support to complement the speaking, and I also appreciated being sought out rather than applying to 1,000 more jobs. And I worked in the diversity department. We advocated for all areas of diversity. It's also very educational to learn about all the areas of diversity. And I was there for 3.5 years, and one of the reasons I decided to move on was I had asked for raises and promotions, and it just wasn't happening. And I was offered an opportunity to work for a disability and employment organization called Disability In, where we advocate for inclusion of people with disabilities across all organizations. And I specifically run an index called the Disability Equality Index, and it helps companies measure how they're doing when it comes to disability inclusion, intentionally including disability in conversations about diversity, making sure disability is included in the diversity and inclusion statement. Let someone know that if they want to request an accommodation, they can, rather than them having to come out and say they need an accommodation. It's important to have those conversations and be open and ask people questions and not make assumptions. And I think people learn more that way. And I think you can all learn from each other by sharing more stories, helping each other understand what may be going on, because each person has a different experience. But it's also important to know that my experience isn't worse than someone else. Someone's challenge isn't less important than my challenge. We all have challenges. I always stop someone when they tell me, it's not as bad as what you experience. But we want to level the playing field. We want to get to a place where people with disabilities are included in society and not to a level above because we've been left behind for so long. We need to get to equality. And I am a little person, and I identify as having a disability. You may meet other little people who may not, but we are considered a disability in the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I chose to advocate for a disability long ago because it's a much larger population than the 30,000 little people in the US. So I encourage you all to get to know people who may have a physical difference or even an invisible difference that they will feel comfortable sharing with you if you build a level of trust. And it just starts with hello. And also know that you're all capable of accomplishing anything you want in life. I'm still figuring out the path and where it's going, and I just enjoy reaching as many people as possible, hoping my story can help others. I'd love to open it up to questions. It's always my favorite part because I love for people to ask questions and get to know who I am, or even something that has nothing to do with what this conference may be about. I think it's important to just open the floor.
Afraid of you. Charming.
I think it's prior perceptions. If they've seen something negative in the media. Even my parents were recently in Hawaii, and they have a good friend who's there every year, and his daughter came this year, and she told my dad that she has a terrible fear of little people. And my dad was like, well, I guess you should meet my daughter, but this is kind of like a weird thing to say. And it's good for people to be open. I want people to be open, but I think it's either the assumption that we're all elves and aliens, just the lack of understanding because there are so few of us. What ends up happening in most situations is I open my mouth and then people get a sigh of relief, like, oh, she can have a conversation. But sometimes that doesn't work. I wish everyone would have that understanding that they shouldn't be fearful, but unfortunately, especially when I was living in New York, going up, seeing thousands of people a day, there were going to be those few that, unfortunately, there's a lot of media out there. Some has been educational, others not as much. So people also call me those crazy people from TV because they have the Lifetime shows, Little Woman, and I'm not a fan of them because you look at reality TV and you think like Desperate Housewives, Real Housewives, any of those shows, that's just, people call it like trashy TV. But for us, anything that's out there affects how we're treated. So when people tell me, oh, you're that crazy one on TV, it's offensive. So don't have fear. What was that?
1 second. We're just going to pass around the mic
Yeah.
so everyone can hear the question.
Perfect.
Oh, where is it? Yes, hi, good morning. Very good speech, by the way. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for sharing. Quick question. I know you mentioned, about comedy and about stuff. Did you ever have like a specific dream since you were little? Like, wow, I dream of being a star on Broadway, or I dream of being an actress, or I dream of being a lawyer. Did you ever have like a specific dream while growing up, despite,
I think it was a doctor. For some reason, that was what I was set on when I was younger. But then when I realized I wasn't that great at taking tests, I figured out maybe I could help people in another way. But it definitely started as a doctor. All right, he's coming.
I thank you again very much for your keynote lecture. Ironically, my PhD dissertation was on disability in the workplace, and part of that had to do with accommodations and job interviews. So my question is, when people are going to job interviews with physical disabilities, some of them chose to disclose after scheduling the job interview, but before they appeared for the job interview, and some of them did not. So do you think that if you had disclosed that you were a little person before the actual job interview occurred, it might have set them more at ease rather than just showing up
I think
and
it would
catching people off guard?
Yeah, I think it would probably be a mix. It would probably be because in reality, I didn't require an accommodation, so I don't know if I would have said it at that point. Now with LinkedIn and me having a website for speaking and other things, there's no way someone can not find out that I'm a little person. But I think it's important just to open up the dialogue and offer the accommodation even when setting up the interview. But then it's tough because will they then cancel the interview? Or that's what I was thinking, just because, especially as I was applying and interviewing in a very image-based world, it was tough because I probably should have. So then maybe I'd get fewer interviews, but it wouldn't waste my time.
Yeah, that's one of the things that some
Yeah.
of my participants considered, that the interviews might be canceled or
Right.
they might not actually be considered if there was an interview, if they disclosed ahead of time.
Right.
But then other people felt as though if they disclosed ahead of time, they could give the interviewer some time to mentally prepare themselves rather than being caught off guard and then be
Right.
shaken throughout the interview.
Right. No, I think that would be in an ideal world, open up that dialogue as soon as possible, just to take the elephant out of the room before it even makes it to the room. But I think people still struggle to do that just because they don't want it to change it in the negative way.
Hi, Becky. My name is Dr. Shan McLennan-Ware. I'm a counseling psychologist, and I wanted to ask you a question about overall just social engagement. It's important for our students to get employed and work, but it's more importantly the social connection and relationships that they make at work and overall loving relationships because we're human.
Right.
Could you spend a few minutes just talking about what it's like dating and how you make social connections at work and friendships, because that's really critical as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I would say the first thing is the relationships I appreciate the most are those where people can be honest with me and give me constructive feedback, because that's the only way I'm going to learn. So my best friend, who I met in college, she constantly will give me constructive feedback, and I appreciate it so much. And someone may say, oh, you're so hard on her, you're making things difficult, or you're being mean. But I don't see it that way, because she's just giving me feedback so I can improve as a human being. And I think people hesitate to give that feedback, and it's important to give that feedback, or what's on your mind, if something bothered you, have that open communication. And when you were asking about the relationships, when I started getting involved in the Little People of America organization, after I was struggling to fit in with my peers and my friends, not knowing whether or not I could date, I fortunately was able to then have some relationships with other little people. People have a preference, but I never really had a preference on who to date. It was just who I connected with as a person. And I had a few relationships long distance. Most little people start off in long distance relationships, because even though there are other little people in whatever city I may be, they may not necessarily be around my age range or have similar interests. So I did some long distance relationships, and then my most recent, I'm actually getting married in August. Just a few years ago, while I was living in New York, we became friends on Facebook. He lives in Wisconsin. I know a lot of people ask about the transition from New York to Wisconsin, but I'm surviving somehow. But it was gaining that understanding, respect, connection. And then I just feel that still we're not there yet with a lot of average-type relationships where you can't escape the fetishes and they can't be honest with you. People I would try to meet here in the city, and it just never ended up leading to anything good. And I thought, I'm okay with being with someone who's another little person who I can connect with, who has similar life experiences. Of course, we go out in public together and people make comments, but we got each other to go through it, and I am thankful to have those connections. And some of my best friends are still part of the Little People organization, even though we're spread all around the country, because we can relate on a deeper level. And even all people with different disabilities and all people in this world I want to be friends with, but sometimes if someone gives you that negative just body language, it makes it harder to break through that. But I also want people to know that if you do something, or even if you did something that you feel bad about in the past, when it comes to a reaction to someone who's different, just move forward and don't think that we're going to be mad at you, because we want to help you get better. And I think that's the biggest thing that people have get in the way, where it prevents you from making change in the future if you don't let go of the past. And then I have people who've asked me when I'm speaking if I sometimes have a guard up based on how people have reacted previously. So I would say that I'm equally responsible, too, to open up in return if someone wants to have those conversations. And we all need to just be aware of our body language and how we interact with people. I hope that helps.
This will be the last question for today. One sec.
Thank you for speaking, and
Thank
your honesty is really refreshing and great. A lot of us are here, and the conference is really about disability in the workplace, and I was wondering if you had advice for people who are helping students trying to get internships and jobs. You learned the hard way about that, and maybe you have some thoughts if you were to do it a second time or do it differently.
Absolutely. I think, especially in the school systems, I know each school system's different, but I feel that there's still a huge disconnect between the Career Center and the Disabilities Accommodation Center. And I know even NYU announced that they're hiring someone who's going to try to bridge that gap, which is very exciting. We need to do more of that because I think people with disabilities are they're missing out on opportunities that are meant to be for everyone. And I think it's important to let them know of these opportunities. And our organization, we actually have a Next Gen Leader program, which is a mentorship program, 6 months, and then people come to our conference and they can interview with our corporate partners. And these corporate partners know what they're walking into. So there were several candidates. There was a deaf female engineer who was in a bidding war with 2 companies. So it's a place where people can come and feel valued and know that they could get hired if they're qualified. So it's a program that people apply to in the fall, and then they get selected and they're matched with a mentor who can give them that constructive feedback going into the conference that will then lead to the interview process. And this is specifically for STEM, finance, and business, because that's what our partners asked for. There were some students, way when it began, who were looking for other positions, but the corporations just didn't know how to help them since those positions didn't exist within their companies. So I think it's important to get the student to be as focused as possible on what it is they want, and don't think that they need to settle for something that it may be harder to help them get. And get those people who work in those positions to help. I know even Carlos found me through the networking of the mayor's office for people with disabilities here, and they do a lot of events, and I've met people, and there's been a lot of crossover of companies that are trying to do better. And I know even JP Morgan Chase has an office for disability inclusion, and it's making sure they're seeking out those candidates with disabilities as well. So have them put themselves out there. And also with diversity programs, a lot of times people may say, oh, this, or a leadership program, someone may say, oh, this is for women or people of color. But it's important to also have people with disabilities apply, and then maybe educate the person who's creating the program to explicitly say that that also includes them, so they know they can move up. I think we are celebrating a lot of employment opportunities and jobs, people getting hired at the bottom line, but we need to all do better at the retention and advancement. So really try to ask people what they want to do and find them those mentors if possible.
Okay, I'm gonna take the prerogative of the chair to ask another question. I know we said
Yes.
last question.
No, yeah.
But what advice would you give the professionals who are working with our students in terms of developing the linkages and relationships with employers? What do employers want to hear? What do they need to hear? What are they hearing that maybe they shouldn't be hearing? You know, I know you've sat on both sides of the equation.
Right.
So
Well, I think a lot of people forget that most accommodations are less than $500. And immediately the person interviewing may think, oh, they're a liability. Oh, this is going to cost a lot to have them here. But they really aren't that expensive. And it's important to figure out how to erase any barriers so that person can have the chance to work somewhere. I think the professionals, the mentors, making sure when you're looking at a job description that they can actually do the job that they're applying to. It's with a reasonable accommodation. But even questions, sometimes on job interviews, on descriptions, it may say, must lift heavy boxes. And what if that job doesn't require that? So as you're talking to the employers, get them to tell you the truth of, is that really necessary? Could the person next to them pull that box if it's a once a month type thing? And it's just having that open dialogue at all levels of just, this is the reality. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to show up every day, and I'm going to work hard. and keep enforcing that.
And the last question, I found you through social media, right? Which is a great tool, but is also somehow a barrier. I mean, it connects you to people if they want to connect with
Right.
you, right? So a lot of folks rely on social media. What other strategies do you think people need to be employing to discover employment opportunities or to
Right.
connect with employers?
I think even showing, because you had found me through a video that I
LinkedIn,
did,
yeah.
I know not every video can be professional quality, but even showing a video of just showing your personality, I think could be helpful. So people know you're human, just like everyone else. Social media is huge, and as you said, it could be a barrier. Now people know about my disability, and there's no way to hide it. If I were to erase everything, maybe, but I do it for a reason, to get out there. And I think another advantage to social media is getting yourself out there and networking with people that you don't think you wouldn't be able to normally connect with. And another program our organization actually has is a Supplier diversity program. Disability-owned businesses, they can get certified, 2-year certification. And I think that's another viable route. If someone finds something they're passionate about, become an entrepreneur, start a business, and prove what's possible. And that can even lead to more opportunities, because your business could get bought out by a company that then would hire you because it's your product.
Right, right. Okay, well, thank you for that.
Thank
and for
you.
everything. Thank you, Becky Curran.